last year. So it's an EKG, and that sums up California's tax structure. It sums up the boom bust as it relates to the revenue picture. And it's not only familiar to you, it was deeply familiar to us in terms of searing consciousness when we put together the budget last year. You may recall that we sent out a very consistent message, particularly as it related to things that were done outside the budget with the legislature. $22 billion of additional spending was sent to me in bills that we rejected. About $10 billion of ongoing money, a little shy of $10 billion, in anticipation of the presentation we're making today. It was crystal clear where things were going even last year. In fact, you'll recall the last time I stood in this room in May, in the May revise, we made the point that 99% of that new revenue that we expressed, or rather that we discussed in May, 99% of it we wanted to set aside for one-time, that's one-time surplus for one-time investments, because of our concern about what was going to happen this year. It's, again, forgive me, a long way of saying nothing about this presentation should surprise anybody, including those who have written about it, because the Legislative Analyst's Office has been previewing, not just our Department of Finance, the presentation here today. But what, again, is consistent is the inconsistency of our revenue on the basis of a progressive tax structure. The good news is, and we'll talk about it, is that because of leadership and because of support from the voters, we've been able to capture a lot of that volatility in terms of set-asides that provide us the buffer that we'll discuss here today and soften the edges of that volatility. So again, we thought we would begin with that familiar slide, and capital gains, 5.52%, and that's the estimated, at least January estimate, in terms of revenue collection. That's capital gains as a percentage of personal income, 9.75 last year. You'll see the historic high in 2000 represented in 10. Here's the budget, $297 billion balanced budget, general fund of about $224 billion, a shortfall that is a little more modest than the one that the LAO projected. Recall they projected a $41 billion decline in revenue. We project a $29.5 billion decline in revenue. We net out, when the dust settles, and we can discuss that later, a shortfall of 22.5, again, compared to their estimate roughly of 25 billion. Let's discuss where we are in terms of our reserves. $35.6 billion of reserves. Interestingly, you'll see the rainy day reserve mirrors 22.4 versus 22.5 billion. This shortfall, $8.5 billion in that public school rainy day fund. Remember, a few years ago, that didn't have a dollar in it. Our emergency break the glass line of credit, $3.8 billion. And of course, that safety net reserve that the legislature wisely supported a number of years ago has just shy of $1 billion. So in terms of hard dollars, $35.6 billion in reserves. We'll continue to make commitments, and I wanted to express this slide up front, to our retirement liabilities. We're here for the long haul, not just the short run. We don't want to be situational in terms of our approach to this budget. We want to sustain those commitments pursuant to Prop 2, but also pursuant to some of the work we have advanced, and Governor Brown certainly advanced in his tenure, to start paying down those long-term obligations. In particular, when you see this slide, think in terms of PERS and retiree health in particular. $9.7 billion we have paid down over the last few years in those supplemental supports. 7.1 we project in the forecast period. And remember, it's the budget year and the forecast that we'll be discussing here today. 1.9 billion, though, in this budget year of additional contribution into the retirement system, PERS, and retiree health. we want to make this point up top. We're keeping our promises. I want folks to know that regardless of this modest shortfall, we'll continue to make unprecedented investments in transforming public education and higher education, and we'll get to that in a moment. Addressing this homeless crisis straight on, no cuts in that space. Housing affordability, continue the progress we've made. Healthcare, no state in America doing more. We'll continue to do more than any other state in America, and no significant impacts on this budget. Wildfires, drought, yes, and floods. All the climate bucket we'll discuss a little later. Keeping California safe, public safety, always top of mind. And as we should, focusing on economic workforce development and the engine of that economic growth, the entrepreneurs and innovators, our small businessmen and women. We'll talk about each and every one of these items, and we will do so with this in mind, that this budget is resilient because we have provided a framework over, I would argue, in the last 9-10 years to invest with intention in these historic reserves. We've eliminated 100%. Governor Brown did the bulk of this, and then we finished that job eliminating the budgetary debt, paid down, I should say, paying down those long-term liabilities along the lines that I just advanced, at $9.7 billion just in the last 4 years. We put an inflation adjustment set aside last year. It didn't get the attention that I thought it deserved. I could not be more grateful for the legislature supporting $10 billion over a multi-year period. You'll see how that has become critical in terms of our efforts to balance without any direct service cuts to the most vulnerable Californians. Discuss more on that inflation adjustment later. And then, once again, focusing one-time surpluses on one-time spending. When all the dust settled on the January and May budget, it was about 93% of all that surplus went for one-time spending. This is among historically high percentage in terms of the fiscal discipline that we maintained over the last few years. I can't say that enough. We're in the position we are today because we were not profligate as it relates to ongoing spending in the past to the degree that often is the case in states large and small across this country. That said, let's jump right into what we are focusing on in terms of baseline priorities. And I know people are eager to see what does our Prop 98, what's the public education K through 14 and higher ed budgets look like. Let's take a look at this graph. You'll see there on the far right, $108.8 billion. That's the Prop 98 funding, $109 billion rolled up. How does that break down per pupil? Higher than it's been, period, full stop. $23,723 is the total per pupil investment. Just put that in perspective. Last year, I said it was the highest it had ever been. It was $22,893. $22,893. This year, it is higher, $23,723. Put it in perspective, just the Prop 98 component of the per pupil, 17 plus thousand. A decade or so ago, 12 years ago, you'll see it was substantially lower, just $7,000. So we have seen significant increase in per pupil investments, and this year an even bigger number than you've seen last year. The COLA under the local control funding formula, 8.13. That's a number I never expected to see. I'm very proud that we were able to prioritize this COLA through LCFF. Goes deep to our values, and it's an expression of our commitment to equity. Last year, put it in perspective, it was about, well, it wasn't about, I think it was 6.56%. So significantly larger COLA this year. As it relates to education, we'll continue our unprecedented transformation of public education and its investment. And when I mean unprecedented, I could lay claim to that, not just rhetorically. I mean, you see here a list, among other things, of the money we've invested, the energy and time, the focus, again, with intention on addressing learning recovery and learning loss. You saw in those national the national data and the scores that came out, California outperforming many, many other states in this country. That does not mean we were excelling, but we were outperformed many other states. And I think a lot more analysis needs to be done in that place. But we're very proud of some of the work we've done in terms of the high-dose tutoring and the efforts and the energy to extend the school days and school years. You'll see that also reflected in our efforts around community schools. We're going to continue these commitments. These dollars are dollars we are investing. We're not backing off. Child, youth, behavioral health, $4.7 billion. Not a state in America doing more in terms of mental health for our children, wellness, not just physical, but adolescent health, mental health, before and after school, that $4 billion ongoing commitment. We're going to get that done. We're committed and resolved to following through, including, yes, on special education. And I'm very proud of the early work we've done. We're not, by any stretch of the imagination, where we need to be, but we're not backing off in terms of accelerating these priorities in terms of our efforts to transform our public education system. I will include a list of other items here. I don't have to go through every single one of them, but I will highlight two of them in particular, and that is this equity multiplier. We made a commitment with leaders in the Assembly and the Senate, led by the great work that former Assemblymember Weber and now current member Weber is doing in terms of equity, and we're committing additional $300 million in this year's budget to advance that commitment and that partnership. We're looking forward to working with the legislature on the details around that. You can see, and I'll extend perhaps a few more comments than I suggested, the universal TK. We're not backing away from that $3 billion full commitment over the course of the next number of years, $1.2 billion ongoing in that space. The universal school meals. Again, no one does what we do. How important will that be, in particular, if we move into a mild recession, a more severe recession? My wife is here, and I can assure you, no greater champion in that space, making sure that wasn't touched in this budget. And, of course, workforce training, critical educator training, and maintaining those commitments on recruiting and retaining high quality, nothing more important, high quality instruction, trained, well-respected and supported teachers. As it relates to respect, we've extended respect to the UC and CSU system in a way that I think gives people a little more confidence in long-term investments, long-term thinking. As you know, we created a partnership, been described as a partnership for achievement, partnership to advance some efforts to address with much more intensity the need to get more Californians enrolled, residential enrollment up, particularly in our UCs, to make sure that we have more throughput in terms of getting people to time to degree and addressing those gaps, and always focused on equity. As a consequence of that, we created a numeric goal, first in state's history, as it relates to outcomes and achievements across the spectrum of issues, including just attainment, degree attainment. But we also did so mindful that they need consistent base funding increases, 5%. Despite a shortfall, I don't think this has been said, despite a shortfall, we're seeing a 5% increase in the base support, both the UC and CSU, part of that commitment. We are fulfilling that commitment. We are not backing away from that. Debt-free college is the framework to which we recognize we need to advance a new approach. And as you may have noted in the last few years, we have been architecting something that is indeed comprehensive, and we would challenge doesn't exist anywhere else. We begin at the beginning with those child savings accounts, $1.9 billion. That has an ongoing commitment that we will fulfill in terms of new cohorts of kindergartners, the middle class scholarships, and the fact that we stacked and supported even more investment in that space. We're continuing that. The College Corps, I think we have 3,200, almost 3,250 people getting those $10,000 stipends, many of them doing tutoring in the classroom. This is a national model. We're going to continue to commit to that. The zero-cost textbooks, going after the racket, and I'll say it again for the third year in a row, that is college textbooks, continue to do more in that space to break things up there, and of course Cal grants and financial aid, and that student housing commitment, not just billions of dollars to address the fundamental costs, not just subsidized costs, but address the underlying costs beyond just tuition. The full cost of attendance. Debt-free college continues to be a priority. So that's in the bucket of keeping our promises. On homelessness, as I said, $15.3 billion package. We're following through on that. No cuts. Continue to make Big investments, historic, unprecedented investments. You can see the priorities here, well described. We've discussed them at length. But the key here, reason I put in that first line, accountability is fundamental. And we've made that crystal clear with local government, and I'm going to double down on this year. We have committed in this budget an additional $1 billion. An additional $1 billion in the January budget. We're not waiting for May, the back and forth, for local governments, COCs, and our cities and counties. But we want more accountability. People just have had it. I want to see these encampments cleaned up. They're done. They're fed up. We've got money in the encampment cleanup, $750 million. We're not cutting a penny of that. We want to see it put to good use. People want to see results. They demand results. I want to see results. I demand results. And working with the legislature, I couldn't be more proud of legislative leadership in this space. They agree. They want more transparency, more accountability for dollars invested. Remember, when we got here, it was roughly $500 million was invested in this space. $15.3 billion in this package, home key, room key to address that transition. And then you see in the board and care and the community care expansion and the behavioral health housing, unprecedented supports. More accountability, more transparency is what we require now, not request in return. Housing affordability is foundational. Obviously, in many ways, it could be, it could have been the slide presented before the housing slide, or rather homeless slide, but you can just get a sense of the investments. $3 billion since 2019, $30 billion that is, $30 billion in housing programs. Just wanted to give people a sense of what the state invests in this space. But the key investment is on streamlining. And I think this is something that is important to highlight, because this Housing Accountability Unit is proving to be extraordinarily valuable. We created it a few years ago. It didn't exist before. The unit is out there reading Planning Commission meetings and notes and minutes of those meetings and City Council meetings. Take a look at what HCD, our housing department, has been doing in terms of sending letters and being crystal clear on our expectations in terms of not just zoning, but building housing at all income levels, just affordable, workforce, as well as market rate. In order to advance that and help it, just in the last few years, I've had the privilege working with the legislature to sign 20 housing-related CEQA reform bills. And last year, we had some significant wins, significant, even by historic terms, significant wins in terms of regulatory and zoning reform. So we really want to continue to advance those efforts as we advance our goal, and we now have that numeric RHNA goal. Look up RHNA later, discuss it in Q&A, 2.5 million units, new statewide goal, and 1 million, again, affordable. That's the numeric, that's the target, and we'll continue to advance these efforts. There's a modest impact in the total housing budget of $350 million. Could discuss that in the Q&A of our team come up, discuss it, particularly on the home buying side. And with interest rates and what's going on, we think that's an appropriate augmentation for the moment. Keeping our promises, including increasing access to health care, includes that. And again, no state in America, no one comes close to what we have done and what we are committed to doing. Let's be more specific on those commitments. $10.7 billion. We're not touching it. And that commitment to CalAIM, the integration of our approach to physical and brain health, the focus on wellness, the focus on investing in health as opposed to treating your sickness, that continues, that unprecedented multi-year effort. And that's why we put that on top and highlighted it. I want to put it in perspective. I mentioned that $4.7 billion for adolescent mental health, unprecedented in the country. Take a look, $8+ billion now just across the spectrum in terms of our mental health supports. It's important to highlight. Everyone highlights the problem. We are highlighting today what we have been doing and the work that needs to be done as we implement and advance these investments in a way where we're focused on accountability and equity and making sure that we reimagine and restructure the system. CalAIM connects deeply to that. You see here the universal coverage, regardless of immigration status. We're all in. We're committed. We're not touching that. We're going to get that done. Expanding middle-class tax subsidies, been a big priority for us. Appreciate the Biden administration prioritizing it as well. Care Court, I have it in there. That's the full implementation investment. That's in our multi-year. We're not touching that. Reproductive health, we're looking for an additional $200 million, trying to get an 1115 waiver. Not trying. We're in a very good place to do so, working with the Biden administration for an additional $200 million on top of what we've done last year. And you'll continue to see more work and some announcements that I'm looking forward to making very shortly as it relates to the next iteration of CalRx, which is basically California competing with Big Pharma. We're doing it on insulin, that $100 million investment, but we also will be doing it in other areas, and we'll be announcing those very shortly. Wildfires, drought, and flood, the climate package more broadly I'll talk about in a moment, but let me break down specifically. People, I'm sure, want to know specific around wildfires and drought. Are you cutting? No. $2.7 billion roughly. Let me be more precise. Modestly. It was 2.8 rounded up. It's 2.7 rounded down this year. Same priorities. There was some dollars we swept up, but it is consistent with the prioritization of the last two budget cycles, an unprecedented investment in forest management, vegetation management, and work around fuel breaks and community hardening and science-based managing, new technologies, new tools. Very, very significant increase in our efforts to make sure that last year was not anomalous in terms of being a relatively mild wildfire season, but we're prepared for next year. As it relates to being prepared, water and drought, 3 years of drought. We're not out of the drought. We can talk more about that. Here are investments. They're very consistent. It was 8.7 to 8.6. Again, sweeping up some modest shifts. So that priority of funding that we work with the legislature, which is equivalent to going out and campaigning on a bond that takes years of political support, working with the legislature, we just put those dollars up, getting those dollars out there, and getting those dollars to use, including immediate drought support, which 40 days ago was top of mind. Right now, what's top of mind is flood investments. And I understand situationally that, as I said, I'll be off after this down to the Central Coast, continuing to make sure that we navigate what appears to be now a series of additional storms that we will have to tackle in the next few days. Just want to put it in perspective what we have tackled in terms of projects, not just promotions, but $1.3 billion has been invested in flood investments since 2019. I noted with a press conference 2 days ago, $738 million over the last 2 years that helped leverage $2.4 billion from the federal government. That's not part of this slide. That's separate and above. We, again, can separate that, discuss that later. But I want to give folks the totality, a sense of what the state alone is doing, and that includes, by the way, $202 million of new investments in the January budget as it relates to delta levees and urban flood risk strategies. As it relates to, again, keeping this state safe, not just from floods, but from all kinds of myriad of issues, and continuing on property, not just violent crime, mitigation and reduction. I'll remind you, we rolled out a public safety plan with the Attorney General. We rolled that plan out all across the state. We did 3 specific events, $758 million invested in that space. That includes these task forces with California Highway Patrol on retail theft, and includes a lot of good work that's been done across the spectrum, working with local and regional law enforcement as well as our federal law enforcement. Victim services, we've increased investments, $65 million alone in officer wellness and training, which we're really proud of. We want to thank our law enforcement officers and all the stress they've been under as well. Wellness and training foundational in terms of advancing those partnerships. We're going to continue the investments in the nonprofit security grants, mindful of the challenges, the hate crimes continue to be persistent across this country and in the state. And yes, combating fentanyl. And I want to just briefly talk about the new investments we're making in this space. $97 million of additional investments beyond what we have been doing. And these are investments above and beyond the investments that are not on this slide, that include 113 National Guards men and women. And again, this hasn't been well discussed, or rather hasn't been, I think, well understood, that we, years ago, pulled the National Guard off the border as it relates to more traditional border interdiction, but we kept men and women of the National Guard on the border as it relates to drug interdiction, and we have supplemented that with an additional $30 million last year. We're not pulling back from that commitment. $30 million. We now have 113 men and women looking in the space broadly. It's fentanyl dominantly, but it's drug interdiction more specifically, not just on the border, but across this state. We have that $7.9 million that's not on this slide with the Department of Justice. AG Bonta's work as it relates to that new fentanyl task force specific. Those dollars we're going to commit, working with the legislature to make sure that we're not backing away, commit to following through on that investment. But here are the new investments above and beyond. The distribution project in Naloxone, Narcan and other things is important, but I wanted to highlight that last one, which may seem to some to be lost because the dollar figure, $3.5 million. This is overdose medication that we're going to send whatever our schools need. Middle and high schools, all the middle, all the high schools in the state of California that need overdose medication will be provided overdose medication. And this budget provides those additional resources if approved by the legislature. This is a top priority. There's not a parent out there that doesn't understand the significance of this fentanyl crisis. There's no one that understands the issue of poverty and disease as it relates to what's going on with homelessness that doesn't understand the consequences of the fentanyl epidemic. So we're looking at it from an enforcement perspective and have been, and stacking on top of that our well-established harm reduction strategies around medical-assisted treatment, and of course, these specific new targeted investments, including in our middle and high schools. Relates to keeping our promises. We also want to maintain our investments in economic and workforce development, small businesses, and here's a highlight just of some of the things we've been doing and will continue to do. I included, by the way, child care on here and workforce. Can't have an economic development strategy without a workforce development strategy. Can't have a workforce development strategy without a child care strategy. And so that $2 billion commitment, that's 200,000 child care slots, we're not going to back away from that multi-year commitment. We've made great progress in the last couple of years advancing those slots. Interestingly, though, we haven't trued up all the slots that were available last year. So we have a little bit of a gap, and our team, Joe and others, can explain some of the funding criteria. We're not going to pull back any of the total funding, but there's some timing on the funding out of the nature of a true-up as it relates to getting people into these high-quality care environments. Workforce development substantially stays the same. To be fully transparent, it's about $110 million of investments that we felt under the circumstances weren't as important as it relates to the shortfall, but $2.1 billion remains. The small business grant release, by the way, I think it's 320,000 businesses have gotten an average of $11,000 of grants, not loans, grants, 320,000 small businesses. We still have money in that program for those that are eligible. We're in our 9th round of distribution, and that's reflected in that $4.2 billion. That's also for small venue grants as well, not just more traditional brick and mortar businesses and live events. You'll see the film tax credits. We're going to commit and continue those investments. Cal competes. We're going to compete as we do with the world we invented. Now competing against us, we've got to compete as it relates to that tax credit program. We're going to commit that $120 million going forward in there, in that bucket, and you can see some highlights of some of the things that we think have paid great dividends. Our travel and tourism investments, the ROI on that has been significant. By the way, there's numerics to bear that up, independent analysis of the success of that program, and we've got a great team partnership with the hospitality industry, and that's part of our larger economic development strategy, as is equity as it relates to connecting dots. Our economic development and industrial economic plan is predicated on regions rising together. And what you see here, and I highlight it because it's important to me, it's important, I think, to all of us. The values of the state around inclusivity, bringing everybody up. Our rural framework, $600 million, never been done. We've never invested dollars comparatively. Here's $600 million, over $500 million in Community Economic Resilience Fund, modeled after the Fresno Drive and BK3 and these other remarkable public-private partnerships, public-public partnerships, not just private partnerships, basically connecting dots, connecting an innovative and entrepreneurial spirit and mindset around workforce and economic development, but recognizing California's many parts and recognizing the unique characteristics of each region. Again, regions rising together, bottom up, not top down. We're not selling down our vision. Sacramento's vision is realized at the local level. $600 million. Also, we put $300 million in a local sustainability fund. This is for folks that are concerned about as you transition to a low-carbon green growth future, as we move away from the past in terms of the old industrial mindset around exclusively a fossil fuel energy framework, now to a more sustainable energy framework and a mix. A local sustainability fund was created last year, and that's to provide support and relief for communities and counties, particularly counties, as it relates to that transition and how it impacts their tax base. Agricultural business grants, foundational. We want to continue those investments, no pulling back. And something that we wanted to highlight that we're also committed to, and that's the transition on oil and gas, and making sure that we are building skills and maintaining that workforce. We're going to need more workers as we transition and cap wells. And those same skills are required, and then new skills will develop and present themselves over the course of years and decades. And we're putting real money, not just rhetorical focus, but real resources in this space. So this is important. Slide for me. We worked hard on this, and I can't be more proud of our partners throughout California and Bakersfield and Fresno, and the mayors there have been so instrumental and helpful, and so many county leaders, and of course our state senators and assembly members that have helped advance and guide these efforts. Look, here's the question I know you all came to understand. That's wonderful, but how are you able then to balance if none of those highlighted priorities and promises are being impacted? And here's how we do it. 22.5, remember, is the number that we have to address. 7.4 we'll address through funding delays, not cuts. Reductions, yes, but I'll talk about those. The 5.7, you have fund shifts, which don't have any direct service impacts. Trigger reductions, which is another way of saying when or if we find federal dollars or we find economic support, or rather revenue support, then those will be reprioritized back. And of course, some strategies around borrowing and some creativity around revenue, but not any new general tax increases. Wanted to make that clear. $7.4 billion in funding delays. What this means is we're looking at investments that we've committed to over the multi-year. We'll continue those investments, but we'll just delay some of those investments. You'll have the opportunity when Joe comes up, our new finance team comes up, they'll walk through the details of that. There are many, many components of these. The overwhelming dominance are capital appropriations, not service appropriations. So that's where that funding delay will occur. You'll have the opportunity with Joe to go through those. But again, primarily capital, and we commit ourselves to that capital. We just extend it out over the multi-year. The reductions would get more attention, obviously, for right reasons, except you may find them a little less problematic in this respect. I mentioned at the top of the presentation the work we did on inflation adjustments. We put $10 billion in the budget. That was not part of those reserves, which was 37.2 last year. Was not part of the 37.2 last year, the 10 billion. It was in addition to for inflation adjustment. 3 billion of that is reflected in the 5.7. So no direct service cuts, 3 billion of that. We also made commitments in addition to the reserves and the 10 billion of resiliency that came in the inflation adjustment over the multi-year. To things like prepaying or paying down, supplementing our our unemployment insurance fund, and we're going to use about $750 million. So you start to see that's 3.7 of 3.75 of the 5.7, how those reductions are reductions utilizing the resilience that we advanced from last year's Budget Act in anticipation of this moment as we previewed it last May and have been previewing it ever since. So those dollars are they were well conceived in terms of where they were appropriated. Thank you to the legislature again for recognizing the importance of that. The budget chairs, Skinner and Ting in particular, and of course 2 leaders for their stewardship on these dollars. And this is exactly why we did that. The team will talk more about the other $2 billion. The fund shifts, this is really just bonds to cash. You know, it was nice over the last few years. And remember, we had a $101.4 billion operating surplus last year. 101.4. That did not include big federal funds. We had a $74.3 billion operating surplus the year before. And then we had that COVID year, $54.3 billion shortfall. I mean, back to that EKG chart, the volatility. Of that 101 and that 74, we were able to start shifting to cash a lot of the bonds, lease revenue bonds, more general obligation bonds, et cetera, which was nice to do, but you didn't have to do it, but it's a nice thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. There was wisdom. Now, for no other reason than it provides flexibility and resilience for a moment like this, and that's exactly what we're looking to. By the way, I'll give you an example, additional example, and the team can walk you through more specific examples. I took it off the CSU and UC slide because you would have rolled your eyes more than perhaps you have so far in this presentation. We're going to use bonds at the CSU. As a trustee of the CSU, I understand this intimately, but we'll offset the cost of those bonds. We're going to ask that CSU use bonds, but we will subsidize through the general fund the debt service on it. That's just one example of bonds to cash. We have more traditional examples, but you'll see things like that, and you'll see something you haven't seen in the past, because as a former trustee, or as an active trustee, as lieutenant governor, as a current trustee, the case is often the bond burden is placed on the system, but without the subsidy from the state. We will provide that subsidy. I just want to make that for clarification purposes. Now, additional $3.9 billion, I mentioned triggers, come primarily, not exclusively, in these 2 buckets. Modestly in the housing, which I mentioned, that $350, and workforce, which I mentioned, that $110. But those are modest in comparison to the 2 big ones on the triggers, which is climate and transportation. Why climate and transportation? Because of the magnitude of those budgets. Unprecedented, simply without any contextual precedent of any subnational jurisdiction anywhere in the world. That may sound like hyperbole, but within a margin error, I think that's not even worth a half a Pinocchio. I think that's politifactable, though now I've opened myself up, but let me say, please include these comments in your analysis. But certainly among the most significant climate investments in world history at a subnational level. Let's be specific about what I mean, just so you don't think I am being hyperbolic. $54 billion was committed this year. We're committing a $48 billion package, which again is just unprecedented investments in this space. But let me give you the rationale, and that's why there's some language here, and I'll try to be brief, and we're almost through this presentation. $48 billion. Here's my personal opinion. We're going to be able, we already have been able to draw down a lot of resources from the federal government because the Biden administration acted with urgency and acted nobly in terms of advancing the cause to low carbon future. We have all of this unprecedented inflation, the IRA Act, and then, of course, the Infrastructure Investment Act. $48 billion has already been received to date. People, if you haven't asked that question, you probably should ask, how much have we received? $48 billion. We could receive an additional $48 billion that substantially go, not specifically, but broadly in this bucket. So not only filling that bucket back up, but substantially increasing the total investment. So we thought that was a smart place to consider the triggers. And if that doesn't materialize, I put up on here an idea, if that doesn't materialize, of a resource bond, which, by the way, we were promoting 3 years ago, you may recall, and then we hit the recession. And then we had so much general fund support that we didn't need it. But our commitment is firm in terms of our efforts, and we want to reinforce that without creating any stress that I know people have around any changes in multi-year appropriations. Accordingly, transportation, let's take a look. $15 billion of past investments, about a $2.2 billion augmentation here. But similarly, we're going to receive $40 billion just in the funding formula, $40 billion. We didn't know this would happen. And it was up to, respectfully, the Republican Party. None of this would have happened. Not a dollar would have come our way if Kevin McCarthy had his way. $40 billion we received, by the way. He's one of the biggest beneficiaries of that in his district. I hope he considers that. We also may receive an additional $15 billion when we get into competitive funding. We brought in my former colleague, mayors, Antonio Villaraigosa and others. He's been doing a wonderful job. We're going aggressively, whole team of folks going after these dollars, working the halls of Congress, and no greater partners than Nancy Pelosi and others. And we're confident we're going to see a substantial amount of those $15 billion. I want to see all of it as it relates to moving beyond the formula funding to the competitive frame on these investments. So those are the two big ones. The final two are on borrowing revenue. I mentioned borrowing. And the borrowing's not about borrowing from you. It's around loans from special funds, something that I know the Assembly put out in their budget package. We provide, I think it's $850 million. Joe will correct me on any of what I've said. In just as an example, one line item on some of the special funds. And then we are bringing back something very familiar to everybody around here. We had it for years and years and years, the MCO tax, well embraced by industry, private, public sector. Feds, we're working with the federal government again on the MCO. That's this year in the fiscal year. Joe, again, correct me, I think it's $316 million in the fiscal year, gets up to about $2 billion in ongoing benefit. But for the purposes of this year, the $1.2 billion in solutions, it's a more modest $316 million because of a timing issue, $2+ billion, and it's potentially $2+ billion, and we'll be talking a lot more about that, already have been with legislative leaders going forward. And going forward, final slide, I'm mindful we need to be more efficient. We need to do what you're doing, what we're doing in our own household, and that's be more efficient. Those 5% government efficiencies, we're not walking away from that. We continue to press the pedal on that and continue to make hundreds of millions of dollars of investments so your tax dollars are being used more efficiently. We're continuing to evaluate all our office space, reconfiguring office space, looking at what telework means as it relates to potential cost savings and more output, more productivity. That's the framework. Better utilization of your tax dollars, including, by the way, reducing travel costs, which continues to be a priority for us. Not everybody has to show up in Orlando, particularly. We can zoom in. And Office of Digital Innovation, I just want to let folks know we stood that up. And that's around, Amy Tong's team more broadly in GovOps and Office of Digital Information more specifically. It's around all those efficiencies. And I'm really excited as we turn the page from hopefully pandemic and plague and wildfires, drought, past floods, we'll get under the hood on some of these big IT projects. And that includes, by the way, the work we continue to do at the DMV. And know this, in just a matter of months, we're finally going to have those digital wallets where you can get your driver's license on a digital wallet. And we're going to do it like no other state has done it. And there's only a few that have, but there's issues. Ours, we think, will be the next level. We're so excited about what the DMV can look like. And, progress has been made there the last few years. With humility, I say that, pending, whatever new analysis of some of the challenges. And speaking of challenges, just because it's important, and Joe, forgive me, but I think it was 314 or 300 313.4, 314.3, I'm dyslexic after all, of investments over the next 3 years in EDD Next. We're not backing away from that, quite the contrary. The transformation of EDD continues, and that's fraud. That also, by the way, is disability insurance, not just the EDD more broadly. I'm not going to cast aspersions about what we inherited, but I will say this: I am not going to allow whoever is up here in 4 years to have the system that we've been struggling with in the last few years. We've got to modernize. We've got to fix that. So that's around government efficiencies. Those are government solutions. Not $1 closing from the rainy day reserve. Why? I don't need to tell you what you already know. Some of you more intimately. If you've been trying to buy a house, interest rates are 6.5%. Some mortgage rates much, getting closer to 7%. I was looking at the average rate for consumers. We're seeing consumer debt, those credit card debts going back up near record highs. 19.6% interest. 19.6% interest. We talk about a recession. Tech has been in a recession for a year. You see growth stocks that have lost 80% of their value. If you ask why California, what more evidence do you need than that? Growth stocks, again, capital gains, we rely on disproportionately. These growth stocks, some losing 80%. Tech's been in a recession for easily a year. The NASDAQ, last I looked, you can, again, fact check this, I think was down 33.1%. Disproportionately impacting the state of California, the volatility. And that was just 2022. So when you look at all these things, the macroeconomics, the geopolitical realities, and a Fed rate that they're talking about bringing as high as 5.4, 5.5%, that makes us very mindful of the uncertainty of this next calendar year. And as a consequence of that, we're not touching the reserves because we have a wait and see approach to this budget in terms of being cautious and being prepared in the May revise when there's more clarity. So I know some may say your rainy day reserve is exactly your shortfall. Can we just call it a day without getting under the hood of the legal constraints under Prop 2 and the like? That, I think, can mislead people into a false sense of where we are. We're in a very volatile moment, perhaps a moment, at least in my lifetime, that my, at least adulthood, I've never been in, and few of us have ever experienced, of uncertainty as it relates to our revenue picture and our structural realities as it relates to California's progressive tax system and our constraints in terms of how we break the glass and utilize our reserves. So that's the overview. I want to just thank, we got a brand new team, not all new members, but Joe at the helm, and he done a magnificent job. Thank you. Our new finance team, and thank you for all the hard work. It's been a little more challenging for different reasons as well. We'll leave it at that. Over the course of the holidays, I know everybody enjoys their holidays. We're all working on this budget. Not that we don't enjoy it. We're blessed. So happy. No, I actually do love it, so I'm being sincere at least. And I know how important it is. I mean, we say this all the time. These numbers are a reflection of our values, what we care about, who we care about. And I hope you'll see in final words, and we'll open up to questions. And as I say, I'll answer your questions, but Joe and the team could fill in more blanks than we typically do as I head down to the Central Coast. But I'm really, I'm just very thankful for the partnership with the legislature. There's a sense that I think people are so prone to old narratives around profligate ways and Democrats managing budgets. But the supplemental commitments we're making on health care, retiree debt, and PERS, STIRS, what we've done in the past, the work we've done on these reserves to bolster them up. We need more work and reforms, I think, on the reserve side to scale them even higher. We've been clear about that in the past. I want to lay out some more details on that in the future, near future. But I think the work that's been done and the this sort of ethic of consciousness that Governor Brown in particular brought back to our budgeting process has allowed us over the last 10 years to be in a position that gives me some confidence that even in a mild recession, $20 to $40 billion additional hit to revenues, that we can weather it and protect the most vulnerable Californians. And if there's any message that is important to advance and communicate, it is that. We are protecting the most vulnerable Californians despite the situational challenge and continuing unprecedented medium and long-term investments into the next generation, to our children, our youth, our families, and to our systems of learning, particularly K through 14, and of course the CSU and UC. So with that, we're happy now to answer any questions, and I'll ask Joe and maybe Eric could come up as well, and they can start filling in some blanks to the extent you have more specific questions under the hood.
Good morning. Good morning, Governor. Nicole Nixon with CAP Radio. This projected budget shortfall means that full implementation will be delayed for many of your priorities, like universal pre-kindergarten. And the economic future is uncertain, as you know. The Legislative Analyst's Office is still projecting budget shortfalls into the next year. Are you willing to make any promises at this point about full implementation for things like transitional kindergarten, health care for undocumented workers, or other priorities? Or maybe to ask that another way, what would you really like to see through before you leave office 4 years from now?
Well, we're not touching those programs. So I appreciate the concern expressed in your question, but I want to just be crystal clear. It's an inaccurate frame. TK is not being impacted, nor is universal health care. So on the two specific points that you offer, full speed ahead. And to your question, thankfully, because, and I appreciate the question, the broader question, they are priorities. They are principles and values that we campaigned on, that I campaigned on my reelection to supporting, and things that we recognize are multi-year investments. And we're here to make sure we follow through and get them done.
With transitional kindergarten, I believe you had wanted to have that fully implemented by 24-25. Now you're looking at the 25-26 budget year. So that will be delayed. Do you think that a possible recession might push that even further? Well,
look, I mean, things that are external. I mean, you get in a recession, you have even more volatility. I mean, who would have, I mean, you may have predicted a war in Ukraine and more geopolitical unrest. We'll see what happens from that perspective and the contours in Asia and elsewhere, and a Fed policy that obviously is having a disproportionate impact, and we're seeing here first those impacts on revenue and volatility. So all those things are hypotheticals. I don't mean to be dismissive about them, but priorities are priorities, and you try to work to advance them. And I think what you've seen, and I hope you've seen it laid out in the slide deck in the presentation, is what we're not touching and what we're not backing away from. Even if some things, and I'm going to have the team clarify on the TK, because I think we're on track. But even if some things are modestly delayed, they're not denied. And I think that's important. And frankly, just as an example, some things are delayed without any external force, meaning they're delayed on the basis of workforce challenges. They're delayed on the basis of zoning and regulatory challenges, certain things that are out of the control even of the state as it relates to local decision making. You see that in childcare often. Last year we had 20,000+ slots, I believe, and not all of them were filled up. It takes time, and sometimes that creates a framework of some modest delays, but the commitment, the resolve, the direction is maintained. Thank you.
Hi, Governor. This is Adam Beam with the Associated Press. It appears that a lot of your plan to cover the shortfall is more about, delaying and shifting things around rather than cuts. I'm wondering, does that mean, are you optimistic that the state's revenues are going to be better in the future? Are we going to have growth? Or is that what you're looking for in the future?
Well, I hope I answered that without even being asked that. in those final comments I made in terms of the uncertainty. I kind of gave you my stack of things that I don't think are fully present in terms of a deeper consciousness as it relates to consumer debt, credit card debt, as it relates to the stress that will place on families, inflation. You know, it's interesting, California's inflation rate peaked at about 8.1% in March of 2022. Significantly, you use your own adjective, but lower than the federal peak of 9.1%. But I'm mindful that 8.1%, when it did peak, about a third of it relates to tenants and their experience in the household. And I'm worried about that experience, that expression, as it relates to consumer debt, interest rate pressures across the spectrum, not least of which, again, Fed rates and the impacts that will have on volatility. So yes, we're mindful of all that, and that's exactly why we're presenting this January budget with a fluid mindset and a flexible mindset that we're going to know more in May, and not touching the reserves yet as a way to offset that anxiety that we were too quick to trigger easier solutions, and we reduce the prospect that we'll have those opportunities in May. So I think this strikes the right balance of flexibility in an uncertain environment.
And what was your thinking on how you came to these decisions on how to cover this shortfall? I'm thinking in particular about the reductions that there are. There's some in climate spending, and there's also the, as you mentioned, the $750 million for the unemployment trust fund, which I think businesses might gripe about. So how did you come to those? What was your thinking about choosing those areas? I know there's no good decisions to be made.
No, and I appreciate that. The magnitude of the climate, I mean, I think we started at 49 and we said, my gosh, this is the most significant climate budget, and then it actually kept stacking and growing. But what helped, and I think those two slides really bear it out, is the federal funds. When we were putting those budgets together, transportation and on climate, maybe you were confident, but few of us were confident that Congress, mansion, cinema, mansion, remember those days? Would actually put together two extraordinary and historic packages. I mean, that's why I've said I don't know a modern president legislatively been more impactful and successful than President Biden. And though the IRA and the Infrastructure Act, how many infrastructure weeks did President Trump have? I mean, didn't do a damn thing. This president delivered, and as a consequence of that delivery, billions, tens of billions of dollars now are flowing in those spaces that were not present in our consciousness earlier when we were putting those budgets together in January, and even some degree in May when that uncertainty persisted. So that's the framework, how we can leverage, how we can resolve in terms of bonds and different strategies, and create some flexibility, preserving and protecting the most vulnerable as a fundamental value, as a baseline, and then not walking away from our long-term commitments to transform education, transform our early childhood investments, and all the other things that we worked so hard together in the last 4 years to advance. So, I mean, all those things are criteria of consideration.
Hi, Governor. Laura Cordy from Politico. Thanks for taking our questions. You spoke to this a bit already, but tech is such a big industry here, and we've seen a lot of high earner layoffs this year. How, in your mind, is that impacting the state as a whole, and do you have advice or requests from the tech industry?
I don't know that I'll offer any advice. We want to be the center of the universe in terms of that innovative entrepreneurial spirit, and that's why we're not naive about those conveyor belts for that talent, which at the end of the day, investment flows where talent goes. And that's California's secret sauce. Our research and development, second to none in the United States. Our partnerships with labs, federal labs, and private, not just public universities, second to none. No one comes close. World class, world beating. More engineers, scientists, Nobel laureates, and more Nobel laureates last year than even the prior year. Patents than any other state in the nation. And I think that's what attracts tech and investment, and we want to maintain that. And so we want to create a hospitable investment environment. We want to embrace that investment by embracing the investments we're making in human capital in particular. That said, look, I made the point, and it's been made by others, but when you have growth stocks that are down off 70, 80%, the examples you used of layoffs, they've been very present in California's consciousness for about a year. It's the cold that becomes the flu for the rest of the nation. In so many ways, we're a preview. Future, we say, about California in every way, shape, or form happens here first, particularly as it relates to the macroeconomics of Fed policy and the impacts that have on markets and capital gains with our progressive tax structure. So these are all situational realities. California, you see that EKG, it still shows this momentum moving in the right direction. I have absolutely no trepidation around California's fate and future. I think we're better positioned than any other jurisdiction in the world, period, full stop. I mean that, and I actually will lay bare that to back that up in my state of the state. But I'm confident that California will be better positioned. UCLA has said this. You don't have to take my words for it. Better positioned than most other states to weather what's to come, to weather a recession.
And I just had, switching gears quickly to care courts, a question about the ongoing funding. I know that counties have been worried about how they're going to pay for this, and I know it's a gradiated system over several years. But with the funding that we currently have laid out, would you be willing to increase that number if counties needed it, or is this going to be a, using your resources wisely conversation?
Well, yeah, I'm ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, aim. I've been around long enough to know that the answer to every question is not more. It's better. So what are the plans? What are the strategies? What are the first cohorts, which is just a few counties? We're trying to bring a few more in, announcements pending. And we're going to be there as partners. We're going to support them. But remember, the Care Court direct appropriation is one modest component of the totality of supports that are being provided under realignment in 2011, not just the 91, and obviously the impacts of Prop 63 as it relates to the Mental Health Services Act and the work that we're doing across the spectrum, be it CalAIM and the supports that we're providing general fund for behavioral health, board and care homes and the like. As you've seen, we've stacked all those up. You can look at our Care Court plan and you can see all of those funding sources in totality, including court funding, separate and above. And so all of that are component parts. What I don't envision, I'm going to keep a positive frame, is the defeatist attitude, well, we just can't do it, we're entering a recession. We're creative, and we have to be mindful that this is the top priority for the vast majority of Californians, at least a plurality of Californians, understandably so. Get people that need help off the street. People are dying on the streets all across this state. The encampments, we've got to clean them up. We've got to take ownership. We've got to take responsibility. More accountability, more transparency. There's never been more resources ever, period, full stop, including with this budget, ever, to support these efforts. We want to see things materialize at the local level. And we look forward to clearing whatever regulatory hurdles. We've done it on a myriad of specifics. And we will continue to the extent they present themselves, to help local government with this endeavor. And Care Court, we think, is a substantial tool in the toolkit, but it's one of many tools to address some of these chronic challenges.
Hi, Governor. Ashley Zavala with KCRA 3. I just want to get a sense of, in what scenario would you consider tapping into reserves? I mean, would it take a recession? I know you just spoke about the optimism of the state's growth, but I mean, and what would a recession do to this budget, essentially? Well,
we've been modeling it. It's an old familiar slide, and somebody was, I didn't want to show it again because I've shown it every presentation. It's that $20 to $40 billion estimate that finance loves to use, and it's a very broad estimate what a recession, a mild recession, may bring in terms of revenue declines. I'll remind you, just to give you the volatility of perspectives, it's all point in time. Even a one-year budget gets trued up. Remember, last year, $101.4 billion. But by the time that 101.4, we already knew it was substantially lower. So you kind of have to look at these as blends, as averages over the course of time, because this all gets trued back up. That's why the LAO suggested at the time wasn't incompetence, quite the contrary. Their estimate was, and by the way, we'll update our estimates shortly as well, a $41 billion revenue impact with their estimate where we'd end up today. Ours today is about 29.5. They suggested a deficit is a little more modest, modestly higher, that is. Ours is a little more modest, a little lower. But this will change. I mean, arguably already changed since we went to print. It's the nature of the day-to-day volatility. But we know what we know when we know it, and that's when we get these withholding data for taxpayers. I should note that the PIT, which is the personal income tax, was down about $25.4 billion from the 2022 Budget Act. Corporate taxes were down $3.8 billion from the 2022 Act, and sales tax was down about $2.5 from the 2022 Budget Act in terms of what we projected. Gives you a sense. Those are the big three. And that gives you a sense, again, that was where we were just a few months ago, gives you a sense of the volatility going forward. So that's at 20 to 40 billion. And when that presents itself, then we go through a vetting process. I can assure you, this is not unfamiliar territory to me. Remember, I was mayor for a couple terms during a recession when the state was raiding county money. Like we sued the Schwarzenegger administration. Don't get any ideas. And you know, you work through these things. This is the nature. And you know, we had that $54.3 billion shortfall in the depths of the pandemic, and we kept the lights on, and we kept our focus, we kept our bearings, and we kept investing in the most vulnerable Californians. And I think that's the approach to the extent I know we're working through hypotheticals. If things are worst, what? It gives you a sense, a playbook of sorts, of what you can expect. But, you know, I highlighted those top 7 or 8 things for a reason, because they express what I have expressed to the people of California as priorities: homelessness and housing, education, you know, public safety, getting these streets clean. These things I'm going to hold dear and hold strong, and work with the legislature that I think broadly shares those values to preserve.
On another topic, but sort of similar, earlier in December, you said that the state had spent about $1 billion at the southern border over the last 3 years, that the state was not in a position going forward to continue doing that. Does that still hold true? Does that money completely stop? Has there been any assurances from the federal government they will help?
We've had, I couldn't, well, let me back up. It is true, the state of California has absorbed about $1 billion. It depends. We've appropriated a little over $1 billion, actually. Not spent it yet, but appropriated. Includes the fiscal year moving in over the course of the next few months. We're not anticipating that we can, in this budget, absorb those costs going forward. Now, here's 2 points that are important to make. One is we don't believe, in some respects, it's necessary, and in this respect in particular, that we have some very intensive, highly medically focused sites that we stood up during the peak of the pandemic, where we did something. Someone needs to tell that guy Sean Hannity, who's out there saying we never test anyone comes over the border. I mean, these guys make stuff up. We were testing people coming over the border, and we were vaccinating people coming over the border. I was hearing them last night just go off. We have to get that off my watch list. That it's important to know what they just make up. So we were testing people. These are what they call TVRC sites, these testing vaccination resource centers. And so those are very intensive. They're medically focused. As we move past the most acute parts of this pandemic, we don't think we have to be at that level of intensity. So we're already looking to phase those out. And then we would look to stack a framework of focus on the most vulnerable. So there's a different spend. There's a different strategy. That said, even in that strategy, there's concerns around a post-Title 42 world. Now we have to recalibrate as it relates to the proposal on parole that the president just made over the weekend. and assess what that means or does not mean in terms of our burdens coming across the border. We have had, to your question around the Biden administration, some remarkably good conversations. And I say remarkably because there's renewed energy and focus in this space, demonstrably so with the president's visit to the border and his own announcement prior to that visit and his current time in Mexico, that give me confidence in the partnership moving forward and resources presenting themselves anew. So the budget lays out less intensive investment, but under the criteria of those 2 points of consideration. We don't need to be as intensive on the medical, vaccination, and testing side, and we anticipate federal support.
Mr. Governor, good morning. Thanks for taking the time. Eitan Wallace here with Nexstar Media California stations. So we'll see you again in May for this, for the updated budget. Now, in a sense, between now and then, what are you most optimistic and hopeful about as it pertains to the economy, and what are you most concerned about?
Well, look, I mean, a few months ago, we had the lowest unemployment rate in California's entire recorded history. Last year, we had the highest surpluses in our entire recorded history. I know a thing or two about employment. I started a dozen plus businesses, and while they're in a blind trust, I'm not naive to the constraints in this labor market that are expressed daily in terms of jobs, listings, and postings that still present themselves as a huge challenge for the private sector. So that gives me some optimism, the nature of that imbalance in terms of favoring more absorption in terms of employment. That said, these layoffs goes to the previous points around tech, though those have been previewed over the course of last year in a way that become more familiar, that haven't necessarily materialized in other sectors yet of our economy. So that gives us pause and caution, but nonetheless, the nature of the constraints of the labor market at the moment give me more confidence. The diversification of our economy, that's the secret in terms of California's remarkable resilience. I mean, you look at our GDP growth, it outperformed the prior 5 years, and this goes back about a year, 18 months ago. You looked at that moment, when you marked that moment, in the prior 5 years, we outperformed all Western democracies in GDP growth. California outperformed Germany and Japan. That's why we're now the fourth largest economy in the world. So California is remarkable in terms of resiliency and its economic output because of its diversification. And that's a godsend, gives me some optimism going forward. The volatility is the stress, but that's why you have Prop 2. That's why we need to reform Prop 2 and raise, I submit, and we previewed this a little bit when we were having those GAN limit conversations. I've lost 90% of you just by saying GAN. And Prop 2, what is he referring to? The rainy day fund. You know, how we can stack more resources in that space. We got creative with the inflation adjustment grants and some other supplementals, and that gave us some shock absorbers for the budget presentation today, and we'll continue to do that in the future to the extent possible. So there's work to do. But look, I'm generally optimistic. I've lived here my entire life. I've seen this volatility. You know, this state has remarkable capacity to recover, and when we do, there's no greater force of economic output than California.
You mentioned that volatility. You began this presentation talking about the capital gains. You know, a lot of folks out there talking about just the state's tax structure in general, so reliant on those capital gains. Is it even realistic to ask if that can be reformed, that is the tax structure, or is that kind of a fairy tale?
Well, I love the frame of your question. It should be. We've had this, I mean, I think at least 3, maybe 2 of the last 4 budget presentations, we've had this conversation, and I've expressed my bias. That said, it's not expressed in public opinion. The public's not there for that reform. It's not necessarily expressed legislatively. It's expressed by members of the legislature to smooth out that volatility, extending the tax to the service sector, which a lot of the red states have done. They tax much more heavily in the service sector than a state like California, many red states. By the way, our tax rates, again, are lower than the state of Texas. I just want to remind everybody out there. 95% of Texans pay higher taxes than Californians. We have the highest tax rate among them with New York, but not everybody lives in that rarefied world. In fact, 99% of you don't. So you pay less taxes. It's just so important to get that out. The lazy punditry on that is galling. It's malpractice because these folks claim to be sophisticated, some of them at least. So you'd have to change that, and it would require a consensus, and I had all the intention of doing this in the world. I'm not abandoning it, and worked very closely then with more information than perhaps you want, and we can talk offline, and forgive everybody that's tuning out because I'm tuning into this conversation. With then Senator Bob Hertzberg, among others, organizations like California Forward and Burgoyne Institute, many folks had put up proposals in this space. They were discussed, the merits, demerits. They're challenging, but I think they have merits and demerit. In the absence of that, what we are doing well, and this was the purpose of Proposition 2, is capturing, it's not dissimilar to what we'll be doing with our 2040 water plan, capturing the extremes, extreme stormwater, extreme revenue, capturing it and setting it aside. It's not groundwater replenishment. It's not storing it above ground. In this case, it's in our Prop 2 account. It's in our safety accounts. It's in those other categories. It's the supplemental appropriations. It's, again, using cash instead of bonds. It's finding those supplements as it relates to the UI and gives us flexibility year to year if we need to tack. And so I think that was the whole idea. Progressive tax system works. It's more fair from certain people's perspective, most people's, and you capture that revenue for exactly the purposes that we are aligning and laying out today, and that is to soften the blows when the volatility turns.
Hi, Governor. Wes Van Tyscher here with Politico. You've talked about relatively minor reductions and delays to your priority spending that you anticipate, but I'm seeing some significant percentage reductions in general fund spending at the agency level. 64% reduction next year for business, consumer services, and housing, 37% natural resources, that kind of thing. Will those kinds of drops in spending affect those agencies' ability to carry out these goals?
I don't expect that, and nor does my team. And I'll have all of our finance folks really get under the hood on the specifics. I'm of a humble opinion. I have an entrepreneurial mindset. I carried that in as a small business person in the work I've done in government, that we could be more efficient, more effective, more productive. Again, more is not always better. Better is better, and that's why those efficiencies are foundational to me. Continuing to find efficiencies, continue not to be wasteful and profligate in terms of our spending, and tightening our belts like every other family's tightening their belt. And so I want to do that. Same time, I want to preserve jobs and careers and livelihoods, and we've done that as well. And so it's finding that right balance. And I'll have Joe and the team talk to you perhaps more about specific departments, but based upon my conversations to specifically your question with our cabinet level leaders, I'm confident in their ability to do their job and deliver on their promotion and promises, though I imagine there will be some at the departmental level griping about some of these augmentations, understandably so. Griping's not the right word. Expressing themselves perhaps differently than I just do.
And one more at the agency level. We've been talking a lot about the ambitious climate goals. The LAO recently weighed in on that. There are some bottlenecks still at utilities and in approving new renewable projects, adding them to the grid. Is there any agency level spending or reforms to address those specific challenges?
Significant, and you saw a lot of those reforms were advanced last year, and I couldn't be more proud. We have more certainty as it relates to a judicial process of 180 days, permitting that has to be done in 180 days for these large-scale renewable projects. We're going to extend that. We're looking to extend some of these similar reforms to other large-scale projects. That's a bit of a preview. We made great progress last year, more than a lot of people had anticipated. So the answer is assuredly yes, affirmatively. It's critical. Time to getting these projects done is critical. As you may note, those Prop 1 dollars That's the $2.7 billion that was set aside for storage. You may recall that bond years ago. It's about 2.77 million acre feet. There are 7 projects, 4 below, 3 above ground. One of them is sites. We put strike teams on all of these projects in order to move these projects along. And I've made it crystal clear to my agency directors and department heads what are the bottlenecks and how can we clear them. And they're federal, they're regional, they're state. They may be private as it relates to water rights, sites. That's the next iteration of issues. We need to know, and we'll be crystal clear in terms of our desire to work with the legislature to clear those roadblocks, because we've got to wake up to the realities of climate change. To your point, as it relates to energy, as it relates to our infrastructure, floods, droughts, conveyance, the whole process that we have created, emphasis process, is creating paralysis and creating problems as a consequence. And we have a responsibility to fix that. Progress was made last year. Yes, I assure you, more progress will be made in the ensuing years.
Hi, Governor. This is Ty with Bloomberg Industry Group. I just had a question. There's been a lot of turmoil in the cryptocurrency market last year, and as a result,
I'm sorry, in the which markets?
The cryptocurrency market.
Okay.
And a lot of, as a result, a sense of urgency.
I'm gonna bring Gail up and talk about the triple currency market. This is where you know your limitations. But keep going. Forgive me, sir.
Yes, and because of that, kind of a sense of urgency among some to put in, guardrails or regulations on that market. And I know your Department of Financial Protection and Innovation is doing some groundwork on that. But I'm curious, do you personally feel a sense of urgency to maybe put in some regulatory framework, this year, sooner or later, or maybe because of, kind of the current financial constraints, that California is facing now, putting it off to later?
I want to absorb your question, and let me make a very public comment. Let's spend some time offline on that, and I'll walk you through where the administration is, what our thoughts are, because particularly as it relates to the markets, I want to be sensitive in terms of responding to you, and we'll do just that very shortly. I see Gail here as my lead on all of this. She's shaking her head enthusiastically so.
Good morning, Governor. It's Laurel Rosenhall with the LA Times. I wanted to ask about how you feel that the change in leadership in the House will impact the budget this year and other governance issues in California.
I don't know that it does. I think it creates speed bumps, it creates stories, it creates some process. But I don't see their agenda getting any traction whatsoever.
Federal funding, if they have an agenda to slash funding, is that going to impact the state?
And what I mean by agenda, I mean across the spectrum, across the board. It takes the President of the United States to support that agenda. He won't. Takes the Senate to support it, the majority, 60 votes in certain instances. They won't. The priorities that the new speaker has advanced are not the priorities shared by the American people, quite the contrary. And so I think they have little traction whatsoever. I think it's just noise. It may have traction on certain networks, but I don't think it will have any meaningful impact. Now, that said, they're not just a speed bump in terms of process and storytelling, but they can be a roadblock in terms of progress we otherwise would be along the lines of what we have experienced the last 2 years. I mean, again, there's just no comparable progress in Congress in my lifetime than what we've seen with the Biden administration working with Speaker Pelosi in the last 24 months. And that momentum, yes, I think will be disrupted, significantly so. And so that indeed is something we're mindful of. That also said, to your question, there's a subtext to your question, I'm also not naive around the obsessiveness of the Republican leaders and leadership around all things California. And so we're mindful. We have got to step up our game in terms of defending our values, defending our progress, And I assure you, we not only have the means to do it, but we also have the mechanism, and we have something more important, the moral authority to push back. And I can assure you we will do just that.
On that note, we do still have a Californian as the Speaker of the House, and I know in the past you and Kevin McCarthy have had a cordial relationship. How would you describe your relationship now?
The same, to be determined. I mean, if his prioritization is a laptop and, you know, look, I know the Speaker cares deeply about his family, cares about